The sun was beginning to set over the wild, untamed land of the American West. A dust storm had just passed through, leaving behind a blanket of thick, golden dust that clung to the dry earth. In the distance, the hills and plains stretched endlessly, a sea of grass with the occasional rock formation dotting the horizon. The wind was quiet now, but the night was coming and the cold would soon follow. In this part of the world, danger could be found in many forms. From the harsh weather, wild animals, and even from other people. On a small, remote ranch, a man sat alone on the porch of his cabin, watching the landscape as the evening drew near. This man named Henry was a rancher. He wasn't a man of many words, preferring the quiet of the land and the solitude that came with it. Henry had lived in the Wild West for most of his life. His face was rough, sunburned, and weathered from years of working outdoors, his hands calloused from hard labor. But there was kindness in his eyes, a softness that not everyone noticed at first. He was a man who had learned to live by his own rules, far from the bustle of cities and the judgment of others. The wild, empty land was his home, and he had no interest in leaving it behind. But that evening, as Henry sat on the porch, something caught his attention. A figure appeared at the edge of the ranch, moving slowly through the dusty path. The figure was small and weak, clearly struggling to make it forward. Henry squinted his eyes, trying to make out who it was. A girl, perhaps? Her clothing was ragged and her steps were unsteady. He could see her shoulders hunched forward as if carrying an invisible weight. She was barely visible against the backdrop of the setting sun, but Henry could tell she was in trouble. She looked exhausted, and her face was pale with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. Henry stood up and made his way toward the gate, his boots kicking up the dust beneath him as he walked. The girl didn't seem to notice him approaching. She stumbled forward, her legs weak, and finally collapsed just a few feet from the gate. Her face hit the ground, and for a moment Henry thought she might have passed out. He quickened his pace and reached her side, kneeling down to check on her. "Hey, you all right?" Henry asked, his voice low but firm. He was used to working with animals, but he hadn't encountered many people out here in this remote part of the world. He didn't know if she could hear him, but he needed to do something. He gently touched her shoulder, feeling her cold skin beneath his fingers. She flinched at the contact but didn't open her eyes. "Please," she whispered, barely able to get the words out. "Let me stay this night. Just this night." Henry didn't understand what she meant at first, but the desperation in her voice was enough to make him pause. He glanced around, wondering if there was anyone else nearby. It didn't make sense for someone to be out here all alone without a horse or any supplies. The nearest town was miles away, and even then it wasn't much more than a few dusty buildings and a saloon. "Where did you come from?" Henry asked, but the girl didn't respond. Instead, she tried to push herself up, but her arms gave out and she fell back down. Henry sighed, his brow furrowing with concern. He could tell she was exhausted, physically and emotionally drained. She needed help. In this part of the world, people didn't ask for help unless they were truly desperate. He had seen his fair share of people in need. Travelers passing through, some with stories of misfortune, others running from something they didn't want to talk about. But this girl seemed different. She was young, barely more than a girl, and whatever had brought her to this point was something he couldn't ignore. "All right," Henry said quietly, helping her sit up. "You can stay the night, but you're going to need to rest." The girl's eyes fluttered open, and for a brief moment Henry saw the depth of fear in them. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. She nodded weakly and let Henry help her to her feet. He supported her as they walked slowly toward the cabin, her steps unsteady and shaky. Once inside, Henry led her to a small room at the back of the cabin. It wasn't much, a simple bed with rough faded blankets and a small wooden dresser, but it would do for the night. Henry went to the stove and started a fire, the crackling warmth filling the room and pushing away the chill from the evening air. He grabbed a bowl of stew from the pot, warmed it up and placed it on the table in front of the girl. "Eat something," he said, his voice softening. "You need to regain your strength." The girl looked at the food, then back at Henry. She didn't say anything at first, but after a long pause she took the bowl and began eating, her hand shaking as she held the spoon. She looked as if she hadn't eaten in days, and the way she devoured the food was a clear sign that her body had been running on empty for a long time. Henry watched her for a moment, but he didn't ask any questions. Some things were better left unsaid. After she finished eating, Henry offered her a warm blanket and left her to rest. He went outside to check on the ranch, making sure everything was in order before the night set in completely. As he worked, he thought about the girl inside. Who was she? What had brought her out here all alone in the wild? He could tell she wasn't from around here. Her accent, the way she carried herself. It was clear she wasn't a typical traveler passing through these parts. When Henry returned to the cabin, the girl was lying in the bed, her eyes closed, though she wasn't asleep. She looked up as he entered, her eyes filled with gratitude but also something else, a deep sadness that Henry couldn't quite place. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice shaky, "for letting me stay. I don't know what I would have done without you." Henry nodded, though he didn't say anything. There were no words to ease the pain she was feeling. No comforting phrases that could undo whatever had brought her to this point. All he could offer was a roof over her head and a safe place for the night. "You're safe here," Henry said quietly. "Just rest. You're not alone anymore." The girl's eyes closed again, and soon the sound of her slow, steady breathing filled the room. Henry stood for a moment looking at her. He didn't know what had brought her to his door, or what the future held for her. But for now at least she was safe, and that was all he could offer. Outside, the wind began to pick up once again, howling across the land. But inside the cabin there was warmth and silence. The night stretched on, and Henry settled into his own bed, his thoughts heavy with questions. What had this girl been running from? Would she stay, or would she vanish into the night as quickly as she had appeared? Only time would tell. The days that followed were quiet, though Henry could sense that something inside the girl had begun to shift. She didn't talk much about her past, but Henry noticed the way she would sometimes stare out the window for long periods, as if she were searching for something. Her eyes would wander over the wide expanse of the land, her gaze lost in the endless horizon. The ranch was peaceful, but it wasn't home to her. Not yet. At first, she stayed in the cabin most of the time, too exhausted to help with much. But as the days passed, she slowly regained her strength. She began to wander around the small ranch, watching Henry work and quietly observing the rhythm of life on the land. He was a man of routine. Every morning he would wake before sunrise, start the fire, check on the animals, and then set about fixing fences or tending to the fields. His life was one of simple labor, but it was a life that suited him. It gave him purpose. One morning the girl surprised him by walking outside as he worked near the barn. She was carrying a bucket of water, a simple task that Henry usually did himself. Her face was still pale, but her steps were stronger, more confident. She smiled faintly as she approached him, holding out the bucket. "I thought you might need this," she said quietly, her voice softer than it had been the first night she arrived. Henry looked at her for a moment before taking the bucket. "You're getting stronger," he said, though it wasn't just the physical strength that impressed him. It was the way she was starting to blend into the rhythm of life here, as if she were beginning to find her place. From that moment on, the girl, whose name was Sarah, began to help around the ranch. She wasn't exactly sure where to start, but Henry showed her the basics. She learned to clean the stables, help with the cattle, and even start fixing some of the old wooden fences that had been in disrepair. It wasn't much, but each small task made her feel more connected to the land and the life Henry had built here. She could feel the weight of her past slowly slipping away as she worked alongside him. As Sarah worked, she often found herself thinking about her life before. She had come from a place of pain, running away from something she couldn't control. But here there was no judgment. There was no one to remind her of the mistakes she had made or the things she had left behind. The ranch, though empty and isolated, was a place of quiet refuge. One evening, as the two of them were working near the barn, Sarah asked Henry something that had been on her mind for a while. "Why did you help me?" she asked, looking up at him with those wide, searching eyes. "Most people wouldn't have taken me in like you did. They would have just turned me away." Henry paused for a moment, his hand resting on the wooden fence he was fixing. He didn't look at her right away, but when he did, his gaze was steady. "I guess I just saw someone who needed help," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You were in a bad place and I couldn't just let you go. The land out here, it doesn't care who you are or where you come from. It's a tough world and I've had my own share of hard times. But helping someone, that's something you can control. That's something you can do." Sarah nodded, taking in his words. She had never expected an answer like that. Most people she had known didn't act out of kindness. They acted out of necessity or fear. But Henry's words were different. It was almost as if he had been shaped by the very land he lived on. A man who understood that sometimes The only thing that could get you through life was the help of others. The days turned into weeks and Sarah's strength grew. She began to enjoy the work, and the quiet, steady life started to feel more like home. The pain of her past was still there, buried deep inside, but it was easier to manage now. She no longer spent her nights staring at the ceiling, wondering if she had made the right choice by leaving. Here she had found peace, a kind of peace that had been missing for so long. One afternoon, Henry and Sarah sat on the porch after a long day of work. The sun was low on the horizon, casting a warm golden light over the ranch. The wind was gentle and the world around them seemed to slow down as the evening set in. It was moments like these that made Henry realize just how much had changed since Sarah's arrival. He had lived alone for years, his only company the land and his animals. At first he had seen Sarah as nothing more than a stranger in need, someone he had helped out of a sense of duty. But now, as they sat together in the quiet evening, Henry realized that he had come to care for her more than he had expected. There was no grand gesture, no sudden realization. It was just the simple, steady way they had worked together, side by side. They had shared stories, laughed over small things, and helped each other in their own quiet ways. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something close. "You've done a lot for me," Sarah said, her voice thoughtful as she looked out over the land. "I never thought I'd find a place like this. I thought I was always going to be running." Henry glanced over at her. "You're not running anymore," he said quietly. She smiled at him, a soft smile that spoke volumes. "No, I guess I'm not." The two of them sat in silence, watching the sun dip below the horizon. In that moment, there was a sense of peace that neither of them had expected to find. It wasn't just about the land or the work. It was about the understanding that, in a world so often defined by hardship, there were still places where people could help each other, where they could find refuge in one another's company. As the days passed, Sarah began to feel a sense of belonging she had never known before. She no longer saw herself as a wanderer or an outsider. She was part of this land, part of this life, and for the first time in a long while she wasn't afraid. She had found not just a home, but a future. But Sarah still didn't know what she would do in the long term. She hadn't forgotten her past, and though the memories were fading, they would always be a part of her. She knew that one day she would have to confront whatever she had been running from. But for now, she had this quiet life, and it was enough. One evening, as Sarah was working in the barn, Henry came to her with a simple offer. "Stay," he said, his voice steady. "You don't have to go anywhere. This land, it's big enough for both of us." For the first time since she arrived, Sarah felt something she hadn't expected: hope. It wasn't a loud, dramatic feeling, but a quiet certainty that for the first time, she wasn't alone in the world. The ranch had become more than just a place to stay. It had become a place where she could build a new life. A place where she could heal. "I'll stay," she said softly, meeting his eyes. "I'll stay." And with that, the decision was made. Henry and Sarah, two people who had come from different paths, would continue on this journey together. It wasn't a story of grand adventures or dramatic twists. It was simply the story of two people finding solace in one another and in the quiet, beautiful life they had built on the land.